I'm Mark Seifter, and this is not Linda Zayas Palmer. But this is Arcane Mark. Welcome everyone. Linda's not here, but I am, and we're going to talk about Pathfinder Second Edition Core Rulebook. Yes, Drenzor, that is the empty chair. Seems like everyone on chat enjoys Core Rulebook more than food poisoning, so that's good. Although Fall of Plaguestone does have its own share of different alchemical substances, as Jaded Tempest mentions. So, I'm going to be talking a little bit about what went into the very early days of making the core rulebook, and we'll just sort of start back in the day. I'm going to not necessarily get everything exactly in order. I might get a few things slightly shifted in order, but we're going to do a lot of the early sort of behind-the-scenes stuff that really we haven't talked about much, not because there's any kind of secrets in it. It's just testing and discovery, but mostly just because of the fact that we were completely keeping this entire process secret at the time we were doing it, and a lot of people forgot about exactly what happened during that time. So, the real beginning of, for me, of knowing about Pathfinder Second Edition was, after I was hired, before my first day, Jason had me come in on one of the days because I had already moved up a few days early, and told me about the product schedule starting with Pathfinder Unchained. And that's where he mentioned, oh yeah, and also there's going to be a Pathfinder Second Edition. And so that wound up being pretty early on for me. There was really no time when I didn't know that there would be one, but we didn't really start doing anything about Pathfinder 2nd Edition in earnest for a little while after that. But not that long after that. Really, we got through that first Gen Con, and where the ACG was coming out, and I hadn't worked on that at all, but, the way the books work, based on the flowchart I showed you guys in the earlier episode, is that it takes a certain amount of time for a book to get printed and to come out at the show. And we had working on Unchained, we were working on Occult Adventures playtest, and really when we got a lot of that stuff through, we started coming up with these brainstormy little documents of ideas for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Things like the 3-action economy. Things like the 4 degrees of success. Things like heightening spells. They were so early on that it is always a little frustrating to me when people say that, because I put out the first doc about heightening spells, it's a little frustrating people say, oh, that was just exactly taken from Pathfinder 5th Edition, because I'm not saying it was a unique idea. In fact, it was really directly taken from heightening, and the ideas of heightening, the ideas of spell point systems, all of the ones in the past in 3rd edition, but it was not taken from 5th edition because 5th edition wasn't even out with heightening by the time that we had written that concept doc. Really, a lot of the things that are similar between 5th and Pathfinder 2nd, which there are a few, are more a example of sort of convergent design, where two groups of people were looking at the same questions and came up with a similar answer. That's not to say, of course, that it's oh yeah, we didn't use anything from 3rd edition or from the Unearthed Arcana or 4th edition as inspiration, because those games were already out. And of course, Steven and Logan worked on 4th edition, so they knew what 4th edition got right and what 4th edition got wrong in their minds. So, let's see. Oh, thanks for subscribing, Frazzle Running. So we had these concept docs, we were passing them around. I had one pretty early on about trying to balance the ability scores. That was one of the few early concept docs that we never really followed all of it, just because there was a lot of reasons why some of my ideas didn't really work for everyone at the office. But we do have a Game Mastery Guide variant that will put back a little bit more of some of those ideas, and some of the newer ones that I came up with during a later stage. I'll talk about later, where Jason told us to go outside the box and come up with some even more dramatic ideas. So we had these concept docs, and that was it for a little bit. But eventually we realized that we couldn't just keep working on the books we were working on. We started accelerating our schedule so that we were going to be able to finish them more quickly. And we put out a very, very rough thumbprint demo version of the game that had... first, we sort of passed around some ideas for the core 4 classes, and then we built not the actual core 4 classes, but just 4 5th level characters. And each one had a different ancestry: elf, dwarf, elven wizard. I think it was a elven wizard, a dwarven fighter. Or no, it might have been that the dwarf was the cleric. It's been a little while since then. And maybe the dwarf or the human was the fighter, and the other one was the cleric, and the halfling was the rogue. And when I say it's a thumbprint, I mean, like, the elf didn't have options for their elf feats. The elf just had the only elf feat that existed in the game, was just whatever that elf had. And that was the one that lets you sort of pick a skill to be trained in when you're like, I've been around for a while, I'll train in a different skill each day. So that just means that nothing existed except for the abilities we gave these characters and a few monsters that we crunched up to fight against them. So, like, the fighter had certain abilities, and one of them, which was... it may not have been literally called Sudden Charge, but it either was called Sudden Charge or had a name very similar to it. It was the old version of Sudden Charge, and it was... We discovered in some of these early demos, the old version, which did not let you move farther and attack during your turn, but instead was like, during initiative, you can move once. It was really, really bad for the game. It didn't make any sense, but we didn't figure that out till after we played. This sounds cool. It helps you close in the fight on the first round. Yeah, it did not. It turned out that we just kept consistently having weird, goofy things where, like, enemies would be, like, flanking a door and setting up some sort of weird positioning, but there's like, nope, the fighter busts in, goes around the corner, and is in this weird spot before anything happens, no matter if they were ambushed or not. So we decided that was not a good feat after doing some of those. Yes, no fighter teleport. So we had that, and we started running it, and because we had 4 classes and 1 game master, what it wound up being is that one person that wasn't on the design team came and guest cameoed as one of the characters. So the very, very first game demo that we ran in this way was run by Steven. And our guest player was Eric Mona, who played the fighter. And we went through a couple of encounters and eventually fought a dragon at the end. There was like a ghoul playing a pipe organ and zombies and all sorts of other shenanigans. And that was not one where the fighter thing was really causing major problems, but it was still... we got to test out the 3-action economy. A lot of things actually worked pretty well for us, given that we... had really only experimented with it a small amount by that point, when we had this sort of the thumbprint that was just at 5th level, and the fighter was kind of kicking butt, and Eric was very happy about that. We also round robined around to all the other designers, also pulling in other people in ensuing weeks. It was sort of like on Fridays we would do this. And so, I don't remember exactly what order it was, other than Steven's one with Eric was first. But the other 3 were that Logan ran something based on something from 4th edition that I don't remember what it's called. But there were, like, orcs tormenting kobolds that were up on a ledge, and we played that with James Sutter, who had a shield and was very, very tactical with it, and really tested out the shield system very well. And that one worked very well. We played another one that was a classic moat house that Jason was running, and that one we had, I believe, Wes as our other player, who was a cleric, and as a cleric he would just swing his mace as every attack, no matter what. And so that one was really interesting, and Steven wound up dying as the first character who died during any of the playtests for Pathfinder Second Edition, mostly because we didn't know what the death and dying rules were, so a snake really ripped up on Steven, and Jason was like, yeah, you're probably dead at this point. That was a lot of damage. He probably wouldn't have died using even the first dying system that you guys had seen, but he sure did take a lot of damage from that snake. And then I ran Black Waters, which is a Pathfinder Society Season 0 adventure, which I converted to 2nd Edition. And in that one, we had James Jacobs as a dwarf. And if you know a lot about James, dwarves are not his favorite, but he tried to do some really fun things with the dwarves, like he would just hide things in his character's beard and go a little over the top with the dwarf cleric. That actually proves that it was the dwarf cleric, because I know James played the dwarf cleric. So, that one was very interesting because I tried a few things. Since we didn't really have all the rules other than the thumbprint, especially the monsters we were just making up based on a few monsters we had created that were baseline monsters. I tried some things I had concepted that were not tried before and really after that I thought were kind of cool, but they were a little complicated, such as there were water bugs in the first fight of Black Waters, and I did a technique from the concept docs where they had resistance to physical damage, they were weak to electricity because they were water bugs, and then if you made the recall knowledge check to know about the bugs, then there was a spot you could hit that actually was not resistant to physical attacks and was weak against piercing. But you couldn't just... They weren't just weak against piercing, but once you knew that, they became weak against piercing. So that was kind of interesting. We didn't wind up going along with that because it's pretty complicated, but it definitely rewarded recall knowledge checks, which the party mostly didn't use. Also, some people had forgotten that they had it, but when someone rolled nature, they were pretty happy. Alright, let's see what chat had been talking about. It's difficult play testing, remembering the current iterations of the rules. You can't imagine what it was like to design them and remember which one was current. Oh, yes. There were dozens and dozens of iterations that you guys never saw, either because they were before all of the iterations, the sort of, I guess we can call them 7, 1.0 through 1.6 of the playtest, after the iterations, or sometimes in between, because we were working feverishly to try to make sure that we had a good solid version for you guys to run after the 2-week period had gone through. Yeah, Frazzle running, having it cost an action is something that basically I don't think almost any of our playtest players in-house had a problem with that. It was just that because it cost an action, they never remembered to do it at first because they were going through the actions in their head and they didn't budget for recall knowledge. When they did, it was really worth it because there were different weaknesses from some of these undead than they were used to seeing. Ling Wu says 177 iterations. I don't know if there were 177 iterations. There were a lot of iterations, though. So we had those. Starting the starting games, and I actually wound up running that Blackwaters again for our French translators, and we decided that Elven was French. If they wanted to speak in Elven, they had all of the characters that spoke Elven between them, because 2 of them were there. So that was kind of fun. Let's see. Oh, 177 is a Starfinder Society joke. Yeah, haven't really been able to keep up with Pathfinder Adventures in the same way that when I didn't work at Paizo I did, due to the fact that now I work here, so I'm always working. But I know a lot about new products and the ones that I work at, and I'm the design lead. But if I'm not the design lead, I'm actually less likely to know about them than I was before. Um, so yeah, we were running these games. All four of the people who were trying it out seemed to have a lot of fun. We learned that our basic concept for the game seemed to be working, and that was a really good first step in the game. So at that point, also, we really didn't have that many options, but we did decide we were going to expand out the game into an actual 1 to 5 version that had the core 4 classes only, and then start building a vertical slice that had the core 4 classes only up to a higher level. We passed them around. We first built them up to level 5, and then we next passed them around to someone else to build up to level 10. However, the pass around didn't always exactly happen in the same rate, and sometimes we had to wind up going 1 to 10 on the same person because someone else was busy. But that was sort of what happened. It was close to what happened. At one point, because I was mocking up pretty much all of the spells that we had in our first version, I think I wound up not doing one of the iterations of a class, so I wound up not seeing. When we passed around, we did a total of 4 passes, and theoretically everyone would have seen all 4 of the core 4 classes between 1 through 20, but I think Wizard I didn't. But don't worry, there were a lot more iterations after that where I wound up close and personal with the Wizard. I actually had built the Elf Wizard for those very, very first games too, but that was not really building the class, it was building like 1 or 2 abilities that the character would have. Alright. Frazzle Running says an ACG spoiler that Jason posted on Instagram. Yeah, I don't know about that, but that could be cool. So we started passing around the classes. We started putting up spells, like a very, very small group of monsters, but more than just, oh, we created this right on the fly for this game. And once we had that, in theory, we could have started playtesting with more in-house groups, but we didn't really do that yet. Lin Wu says that the Instagram was about designing new Swashbuckler. Was this his post about bringing the Advanced Player's Guide and the Advanced Class Guide to a design meeting? You can guess which thing that we were doing at that point, but if you remember, all 4 of the announced classes for the new Advanced Player's Guide were either from the original Advanced Player's Guide or Advanced Class Guide. So, nonetheless, even though we weren't doing sort of like more official playtesting with the company writ large, I was doing my own playtesting with Linda just at home for a while because I wanted to learn more about what we were building while we were building it so that I could adjust things that seemed like they were off. So we wound up playing a little bit of Serpent's Skull with Linda was playing actually all 4 characters. Usually when we do the 2 of us together, the GM runs the minority of characters, so the GM would have run like 1 character out of 4 or something like that. But this time, just because I was taking notes and running in a brand new system, Linda ran all 4. So we made it through all of Souls for Smuggler's Shift and also the beginning of part 2. But the problem was we sort of ran out of game because we only had 5 levels for a while. And then we didn't wind up picking it up again after we had built up to level 10. But yeah, it was interesting. And during that game, we sort of hodgepodge together an Abyssal Sorcerer for because the Sorcerer class did not exist. Only the Wizard, Cleric, Fighter, and Rogue existed. And we had a Halfling Rogue, an Elven Fighter who was all about getting that extra speed and using it to wear heavy armor, and so that he moved at regular speed. With his shield that he started using when he realized how much it was protecting him from getting killed. But he had first started by just using a big weapon. Just that's how Linda started. That's how in Pathfinder First it was always a good idea. But then the shield was just doing so well. Then there was a cleric of Nethys who had like a very early version of Wizard Dedication that we were putting together. Named Jana, and then the fourth one was the sorcerer that we sort of kit bashed together. That was the first spontaneous character during the playtest, and we just sort of played it through part 1 and the beginning of part 2 pretty quickly. And there were some other interesting things, like certain spells weren't quite ready yet, like summoning. I just sort of created little summon bespoke creatures that were very, very themed to the character. So the Abyssal Sorcerer, who was sort of had blood that was infused in her by a weird ritual by Zora worshippers, got these weird like blood demons that were just appropriate for the level of the summon. And the Cleric of Nethys got like these random destruction or creation, you find out when you summon it, themed aeons that were just sort of very themed to the character because, hey, we didn't have enough creatures to summon, so I just made some up. It wound up working pretty well. That was my first time of realizing that converting an adventure from Pathfinder First Edition into even this pseudo, proto, alpha, super early stage was actually not hard to do. And it wound up working pretty well. Let's see. It looks like there were people in chat are talking about playing trolls, using a reincarnate gone horribly wrong or something like that. No, it was just a love of Karamag and augurs. That makes sense. Alright, very cool. So, while all this was going on, obviously, back at the office, we were working on a lot of books, right? Because we had all the books we've done Design Diaries for. We had Unchained, we had Occult Adventures, Bestiary 5, which we haven't done the Design Diary for, but it seems like Design Diaries for the Pathfinder First Edition books are not as popular right now, so maybe we won't. And then all moving forward from there, after Bestiary 5 was Ultimate Intrigue, I think, and Horror Adventures, Villain Codex, and on and on. Although I think Villain Codex was we had really pushed to be really ahead, and by the time we were through with Villain Codex, we were basically going to be working entirely on Pathfinder Second Edition, except, spoiler alert, Starfinder! So, we wound up doing a lot of early Starfinder work, then handing that over to the Starfinder team. And then actually Logan and I got pulled back into Starfinder, and we did a huge amount of sort of later Starfinder work as well. While Steven and a little bit Jason, but he's often in meetings, but so a lot Steven tried to keep both the Pathfinder 2 flame lit and also Ultimate Wilderness as much as he could. And we also had James Jacobs pitch in to help a little bit on Ultimate Wilderness 2. He did a pretty good percentage of the book as well. Because Logan and I were back on Starfinder. It was supposed to be on 2nd Edition, but also we had Ultimate Wilderness. So, Possible Cabbage wonders, how much did the development of Starfinder affect the 2nd Edition design process? Well, originally the 2nd Edition was going to come out 1 year sooner. I'm not so sure that would have been possible even if we didn't do Starfinder, but that was the plan. Eventually, the plan of Starfinder meant that we knew that was a big Gen Con launch, so we couldn't launch that at the same time as Pathfinder 2nd Edition, so we pushed Pathfinder 2nd Edition by a year. And then it took probably less than a year's worth of resources out of the design team, but a very significant amount of resources from us. And then, of course, the Starfinder team was spinning up. Ular Warlord, I love Villain Codex 2. It just has these really fun groups that you could use together. And it just, yeah, I like just some of the hooks that were on them. Yeah, like the Demon Knights that you mentioned. There's the Secret Society that turns people into mice and hunts them with cat masks. There was the very friendly Arcane Guild that's all about philanthropy, except for that they suck the life out of children so that their leader can have a living body, since she's actually a lich. And all sorts of other fun groups, including Linda's nature group that has a Leshy with a drum that's very angry and is a scald and makes the trees angry too. So we definitely did a lot of good Pathfinder First Edition work during that time, although like we didn't have the full team on Wilderness, and past Wilderness we didn't do at all. Like, you'll see it that like James with a second pass by I think John Compton was it for the Adventurer's Guide, and James did the helped us out with Bestiary 6, and also with Planar Adventures. So really we couldn't have made it if we didn't have the ability to call on other people to help handle some of those last books for us. Meanwhile, we sort of dove directly into refining Pathfinder Second Edition. So that included building up to 10th level in the core classes. We, after about a year from when we probably could have been doing in-house playtests, we started doing in-house playtests in earnest. And what we wound up getting was Steven had an in-house playtest that had a mix of some of like people from the warehousing customer service. Logan had an eclectic group that I'm not sure what the exact mix and strategy was for that group. He was running a version of like Tamawachin. I don't remember what Steven was running. It might have been a version of Temple of Elemental Evil, perhaps. I think that it was. And then I wound up with a group where I specifically invited every developer or editor who was not in somebody else's group to join my group, because I wanted the development and editing teams to have the best possible sort of knowledge about Pathfinder Second Edition. And that wound up meaning that like 17 or 18 people were in that game, but we still usually didn't have 4 people to play when we tried to run, because Paizo is very, very busy all of the time. But we did manage to play Shattered Star from part 1 up through part 4 before the end of the playtest with the Paizo people, and lots of switching around. And we just, because Shattered Star was the Pathfinder Society, I picked that because the Society, in theory, could send lots of different agents, and that is okay. There were 18 agents on the job, more than 18 actually, is John Compton wanted to help us playtest as many classes as possible, so he came with a different character every week when he came. And for a total of like around 8 characters, probably 6 to 8 by the time that everything was said and done. So we made it not to the end of part 4. We're still in part 4. They're down, they've through the first Doomsday door, and they're in the lower dungeons of the Abbey. And yes, as Luis says, rest in peace Randall, because that is where I got my first kill in Pathfinder Second Edition, which was Luis's character, Randall, a freehand fighter who we also sometimes called the Marlboro of the team, because he put like 4 debuffs on everything at the same time. And he was killed in part 3 by a Doulahan, very deadly Doulahan, and I let him play the dog that his spirit became, and he almost killed Cobra, Mike's monk of running away, because he was real focused on going after him, and most enemies weren't. And that's when he came in as Solveig. We also had Linda's character in that game, who was constantly changing. Illyria, she was based off of her Curse of the Crimson Throne character, but constantly changing into classes that were actually available. So, Cleric of Gorham instead of a Barbarian at first. I think she tried out Fighter with Cleric Multiclass, then Barbarian with Cleric Multiclass when Barbarian came out, because we started building some of the other other classes later on once we were pretty sure about the first classes up to 10. And all the different incarnations of Illyria have been around. We haven't really played since the end of the playtest period proper, whereas I have been continuing my War for the Crown game, as I've mentioned to you guys before on this show. And we are nearing the end of part 5. We just keep missing, unfortunately. This week we actually almost had quorum, but then it wound up that one of our players, they're all usually remote, is actually here in the area, and he could only play if he came to our apartment, which he can't because Linda's sick. So we wound up missing another week, but any week now we're going to go into that very final dungeon at the end of part 5 and really get into part 6 and War for the Crown. I'm very excited. Finishing an AP has never been this fast for our group. In fact, getting to part 4 was very impressive for the Paizo group. We had people popping in, popping out, that sometimes never returning again because they didn't have enough time. And I ran a few one-shot adventures as well, especially just to test out a few theories. For example, I ran Bid for Alabastrine, a adventure from Pathfinder Society by Thirsty, and developed by Linda, who that's all about like social interactions and the influence system, because I wanted to see how that worked out. And that's where we had the first paladin who fell in all of Pathfinder Second Edition, when they were at the party, and in that adventure there's an Aspis agent who's trying to bid for certain sections of the city, and the Pathfinder Society is trying to make the Aspis Consortium not win any of the sections of the city, or as few as possible. The group had been doing very, very well, but there's this one elf they hadn't convinced yet. So Ron with his paladin was going over to the elf and was like, alright, I'm going to tell the elf that he can't trust the Aspis Consortium agent, this agent, that she always lies and cheats and does not keep her deals and bargains that she says she's going to make. And so, the one thing that the group knew about this person that they were up against, the one thing is that she might be the enemy, she might be the adversary, but she always keeps her deals and bargains when she makes them. She's very lawful, and you can trust her on an agreement. So I reminded Ron, I was like, Ron, I know you said you were going to say this, but this is like the one thing you could say that would be a lie, and that violates your paladin's code. He's like, oh, okay, yeah, no problem. Now, no, they were on the plane of Axis at this moment. So, and this is obviously not an evil act, but it was chaotic, and was also breaking the paladin's code. So, he told this lie, and I was like, okay, I'm going to give you a major circumstance bonus because of the fact that he would never expect a paladin is just going to fall on purpose and lie to him about this fact. So go ahead and roll. And Ron's like, alright, I have great charisma, and I'm going to roll this out. And remember, this was before we made untrained in a skill like super terrible, so he wasn't really that bad at deception. He wasn't great, but with his bonus, he was okay, even though he was untrained. And so he rolled, and he rolled a 2. So the elf could tell he was lying. Like, I had a bunch of like, Aeons just sort of turned towards, and like, what's going on? And, like, the host was like, oh, I'm so sorry. We don't usually have paladins falling with this group. And the Aspis person came up and said, see, I told you about the Pathfinder Society. They'll do anything. They'll tell you any lie to try to get you to listen to them. Just like I've been saying this whole time. Like, look at this. They coerced a paladin into falling. This is what the Pathfinder Society is like. Sure, they have more paladins than the Aspis Consortium does, but look what they do to them. And then Linda, that was Sela that Ron was playing. So Linda was playing Kyra, and they gave counseling to Sela for the rest of the game, and was sort of a little bit distracted from the bidding process for the rest of that point. So that is how Ron became the first paladin to fall in Pathfinder Second Edition. And I think that even people who get mad at are like, well, we don't want paladins to fall in those paladin discussions, would agree that I was very fair to him when I just told him flat out that maybe he could think of a different wording. But I think he kind of wanted the cachet of being the first paladin to fall in in Pathfinder Second Edition. That's sort of what my gut is about that. Um, and yeah, Ular Warlord, the tenets being more concrete was something like I was really passionate on, so I worked on those tenets. I workshopped it with the organized play team because they of course have to deal with all of organized play and the sort of table friction that can come from GM and the player not really agreeing about what's going to go on with a paladin's code. And so the tenets are more concrete. It's more obvious which order they apply in. But Ron and I agreed that there was no higher tenet that was protecting him here from lying. He was just lying to get an advantage for himself. It was not protecting innocence. It was not any of the other things that were above. And so he fell from grace. It was okay. There was only one combat encounter in that adventure. It had already happened. So it was just a fun role-playing moment. And we had all sorts... I also sort of, playtested a little bit of Doomsday Dawn pieces with them as well early on. And then we moved back into Shattered Star and just continued onward. He fell from grace. It was okay. Yes, it was okay. Because it was a one-shot. It might not have been as okay if it was not a one-shot. So, let's see. We were doing the Shattered Star. We built up to the 10. And that point was when we really started building out some of the ideas for the additional classes. But also, we wanted to make sure that we had a vertical slice of the game, and a vertical slice meaning something that went like sort of all the way top to bottom that was reasonable enough. So we expanded out to some of the additional classes, and we also built up to some of the higher level abilities. And this allowed us to sort of, in theory, test or at least pit things against each other like throughout the process of play and make sure that play was actually working out at higher levels. In practice, we didn't at that first stage when we were coming out with it throw that many playtest games at first. One thing I missed before we did that, so I guess we can hold our horses and go back a moment. While I was running that Shattered Star, there was another time on a Friday we had already done those Fridays where we brought 4 people in to play, where we just played with just the design team, and when we had the actual classes out to 5th level, high enough level, 10th level, I ran while also playing the rogue, and the other 3 designers played the other characters. Jason was a cleric, and let's see, I can't remember if Steven was the wizard there or Logan was the wizard, and one of them was the wizard, one of them was the fighter. I think that Logan was the fighter because Steven had been the fighter before, but I can't remember. Steven been the wizard a few times too. I ran burnt offerings for everybody on the design team, and that way we ran like a more full adventure path volume, so we could see like what happened among all of us when we were actually keeping characters persistent and making sure we could tell a very famous and popular story that we could tell in Pathfinder First Edition, and the answer was, we definitely could. So, okay, that was the thing I'd forgotten from back in time. So, moving forward in time, we started expanding out, and we started trying to get together some of the ideas for what would be the 7 playtest goals that we would test in Doomsday Dawn. Because the first thing Doomsday Dawn wasn't even necessarily a plot line. It really actually shifted back and forth a lot of times about what it was going to be. Like, first it was probably going to be about the Doomsday Clock because that was like really at that exact same time that this was happening. But there were some other ideas. Jason had the idea of going back to the different places that all of the adventures had happened in. There was a moment where there was a proposal that like maybe it would be mostly about Nocticula instead of the Doomsday Clock, or several other options. But we wanted a storyline that could have a bunch of different opponents and a bunch of different tests rather than say like demons a lot of the time. and it eventually wound up being the Doomsday plotline. It still leans pretty heavily into Dominion of the Black, but it got all 7 of the goals that we determined that we wanted, which were: goal number 1, run a simple or first level adventure for new characters and that are just starting out learning the game, and have it work out. See if it works out. See how it goes. Something very classic. Something at first level. Goal number 2: deal with weird environmental things that cause frustration and problems for one side or the other, or both, and also see how much that makes it harder, makes an encounter harder if we don't take them into account. Goal number 3 was one that Jason really brought up, because he said that in Pathfinder First Edition playtesting, healing allies and harming undead at the same time tested as being too much. So he was wondering, if we fought lots and lots of undead, lots of healers, is it just not fun because everything explodes? The answer was no. It's jolly fun, and also everything explodes, but not quite as quickly and problematically as we were worried about. And that was test number 3. Test number 4 is, what about a Nova day, like in Kingmaker, where you just only have one encounter? And in Pathfinder First Edition, you could throw everything into that one encounter and just, it's over immediately, and you don't really have fun with the encounter, almost no matter how hard the encounter is, if you know you can Nova. So this was, you know you can Nova, and we'll do some exploration around the hex map, kind of like Kingmaker. What happens? And that's where we found out, hey, if we throw a vastly overpowered sea serpent at you, even if you know you can Nova, it's actually vastly overpowered, which is good. Now we know not to do that, because in Pathfinder First Edition, and that's what we were testing, in Pathfinder First Edition, the group would have annihilated that sea serpent. It probably would have been like slumbered or something on the first round, and then coup de grace, or that's not even a Nova. But there are all sorts of things that could have happened in Pathfinder First. So in Second, we found out an overpowered sea serpent was in fact an overpowered sea serpent. So the 5th one, with all the demons in the world, the fight until you lose probably endurance test, was maybe one of the most important tests that we ran in the entire playtest. And the reason for that is, have you ever noticed on the message boards or other places online that a lot of people you come across drastically underestimate defensive abilities in Pathfinder First Edition? They dismiss them as like, oh yeah, whatever, that didn't do very much. A lot of the people who do that are usually ones who play in groups that are just kind of playing rocket tag, except for they have rockets and the enemies have beanbag guns, and they're winning very quickly. They don't actually fight an endurance test. And in fact, in Pathfinder First Edition, not that many groups actually... I mean, we designed it to try to make it so you don't lose most of the time. And even if you're playing normally, and a lot of groups are optimized past the amount that their defenses are optimized, sometimes intentionally, and they just want to do a cakewalk, so you don't see the value of the defensive abilities because you're not doing a stress test. Ular Warlord, let's see. Someone was asking, you asked, did anyone beat all the waves? I don't know if anyone on the show beat all the waves, but they beat, there were groups that did. They usually were ones who very intelligently used knowledge to exploit the weaknesses, elemental weaknesses that the demons had back in the playtest, combined with good damage, often monks for the cold iron, and other options like that. So, anyway, going back to a stress test. Defensive and recovery abilities really, really require a stress test. If you've ever met anyone who thinks that First Edition, PF1, First Edition, first printing Crane Wing is a reasonable option for most games, then chances are they haven't really played an encounter where the group was losing the encounter, or would have lost the encounter without Crane Wing. Or if they did, it might have been that it was like all spellcasters or something like that. I'm not sure. Because one thing I do know is that I have stress tested Crane Wing in encounters. Linda's mentioning the T-Rex skeleton, which I was going to mention too. But yeah, due to a mistake in the way that our our adventure captain in very early days thought that 1 to 7 sub-tier adventures worked. We sometimes had level 1 or 2 characters in the 6 to 7 sub-tier of PFS games a few times. And yes, my second level Crane Wing character defeated a Tyrannosaurus Rex skeleton by himself. It could not fit out of the room to attack anybody else. It was a mindless undead, so it couldn't use any tactic other than biting me, and I automatically blocked it. There were a lot of other things like that, though, and definitely many situations where our party was mostly actually overwhelmed, except for then my character. Like, there was one encounter in, I want to say, Prince of Augustana, where we fought so many dretches that the entire rest of the party was nauseated, and my guy just killed all the dretches. So, defensive abilities are very, very hard to balance unless you run an endurance test, and that's what we wanted to do. Because most of the time, it's not fun to run an endurance test, and it's not fun to almost die. It's not fun to die. So we had to explicitly write an adventure to ask people to do that because, oh man, nobody was going to do that, or very few people, if we didn't. And we wouldn't have learned about a lot more about shields, defensive options if we hadn't. And Jaded Tempest is right. It's only fun when it's a one-shot. Ulor Warlord, your first tabletop experience was a grisly death. Well, I mean, it definitely happens, but you usually don't test those endurance tests on purpose. It sometimes winds up being sort of something that happens. And I wasn't really necessarily saying dying or even TPKing is always going to be not fun. I'm mostly saying that what's going to be not fun is the GM setting you up to lose. And in a regular adventure, not just that you died and there was an exciting and reasonable reason for grisly death, but just the GM was like, no, this was just too hard, and you were gonna lose, and that was my point. So we did set you up to probably lose, although Jason is really good at being harsh but fair, and he could have thrown something that was just a tad more difficult at you guys and had no groups win, or almost none. But he threw something that was just barely close to fair enough that a small but non-negligible percentage of groups managed to win. And that was pretty cool. So, then we also had... the direction of the Discord is... Yes, thanks for the link. There's also an invite me... or invite.gg link that says Arcade Mart. They're both exactly the same thing. And then the sixth test, of course, was testing a sort of more social role-playing style adventure. Honestly, that one, just because I not only do I like role-playing a lot, but it turns out one thing we learned from part 4 is that you guys like role-playing a lot. So that wound up being one of the most fun adventures for many groups, just because there wasn't a lot of role-playing in the other ones, and most groups actually enjoy role-playing over a stress test with lots of combats. It was very interesting to learn during the playtest, and I've mentioned this before, because there's sort of a feeling among, I guess that means it's among 75% or more of players, so you guys and me and all of the players, we sort of all feel, or at least I did until I read this, like it's like, oh yeah, I like role-playing a lot, but you know, I'm in this minority, maybe 10 to 20% of players, and probably 80% of people just want to come in and do lots of combats in a row. And they want a dungeon and it's just all fights. But I'm one of the few who wants it to have a lot of role-playing. But it turns out it's a reverse, and most people want to do a lot of role-playing. And so that made part 6 just a whole lot of fun, because it had a lot of role-playing. It was testing that. Can you do a role-playing and sort of a heist at really high levels and still have it work without the... did we effectively change spells enough so that the spellcasters are very much helping, but not being like, oh yeah, we'll do everything, rogue, go home, you're useless. And that wound up being true, which was very good. And then our last playtest goal for part 7, we found out we were just writing these goals before we figured out what the actual adventures were. Part 7 was the most similar to part 1, which is just except it's at high levels. So it's like, can you do a classic adventure, no other extra goals, at super high level 17 without having the game sort of bust apart, degenerate into Rocket Tag, everything getting skipped by a weird way, and can it just work out and be a classic adventure that we sort of always wanted high level play to be, but it wasn't always, and it was very hard for people to run. I ran it, I enjoyed it, but a lot of you guys have been online saying, oh, it's very challenging to run it at high levels, and adventure paths usually didn't make it up to 20. Ograx mentions that role-playing is sometimes hard for people due to shyness or something they're not comfortable with. That's true, but I think that when I say role-playing, I might even not necessarily mean like method acting in character, but it just seemed like a lot of groups wanted to try to like talk it out when they had an option or do a non-combat solution to a problem. So that's not even necessarily just roleplay. That's sort of just engaging with the non-encounter sort of style of the game, I suppose. And Frazzle running. I agree. Part 7 I think worked out very well, and that was another one where we tested it and found out that we met our goal. In fact, surprisingly enough, even though there were certainly a lot of people who were frustrated by some aspects of the playtest, especially when they were not thinking of it as being a stress test as much, a lot of the different sections met our goals. Like, Part 5, a lot of people died, but it met our goals. Part 4, there was a lot of trouble with some of those encounters, but it met our goals. We even said at the beginning of Part 4, hey, we're throwing big, really hard encounters at you every time because it's Nova, so GM, give the players a way to escape, because even though this isn't the stress test where you fight until you die, they might just die. We're not sure. We don't know how it's going to work out yet. In Part 2, it met our goals because the environments proved to be hard enough that they should have been included. We didn't, and we knew that we maybe should, so we wanted to see what happens if we don't include environments as part of what makes an encounter challenging and just flat out only use the XP of the monsters, and it showed that the environment is a part of the fight. Tabletop is a refuge for people who thought if only you could talk to the monsters as a salient point. That's a good point, Possible Cabbage. Let's see. Those are the 7 real goals that we had come up with, and we started figuring out like who was going to take care of handling some of the different sections of the Doomsday Dawn. And we knew that we wanted James Jacobs to be the developer for it, since he's done so much with the Pathfinder Adventure Paths, and we were sort of pulling together from a bunch of different Pathfinder Adventure Paths. Plus, he wrote the final section. So we also had the design team pulling together, and we grabbed Amanda, who really likes to do a lot of horror stuff when it comes to adventures, to do Part 3. So we had a lot of people who were very, very tied into the project who were working on that. So the Dark Swordsman asks, where did the staff at Paizo get the ideas and inspirations for APs and modules? Mostly just somebody has an idea, and then more than one somebody has an idea, and then they all say what the ideas are, and then people decide, oh, that's a really good idea. Let's all be cops in Absalom, and then that becomes an AP. Obviously, there's way more that goes into actually building the AP, coming up with the outline, sending it in. Just like I showed you how a product gets made. That would be just the first step of what's that very beginning inspiration of what is the AP. There's a ton of work in there that comes. But you remember, if you go to the episode, the first step is inspiration, and that's the inspiration step. Let's see. What were the processes for the first APs in Plaguestone for a system that was still under design? Well, basically, so this is fast forwarding a little bit, but they wrote using the playtest. Then basically, Jason quickly changed to the final version on Plaguestone when it came to AP Book 1. A lot of that was Logan during a design pass, because we do have designers who The amount we can do passes on each book varies very much. The early products we did pretty solid passes. Some of these later ones, when people know the game more and we are also more behind on Game Mastery Guide, we've not necessarily done a full pass. But I also did do a design pass on Playstone after Jason did, so he wasn't the only designer who looked at it, but he had done almost everything. Whereas when Logan had to do his pass on book 1 of the AP, it actually, Logan wound up taking a while. There were a lot of things he had to do because that's just how it worked out. And that's also the way we did it for Lost Omens World Guide, is Logan and I went through... I basically just looked at the backgrounds because they're easy enough, but Logan helped with the archetypes because you want more than one designer looking at the very first archetypes. Kaffel Byler says that Eric said most people when asking for a piece start with, I want an AP in Ustalov or Tian Sha, where the actual pros is, we should do a police procedural AP, or we should do one where you're in a circus. I think that that is true to an extent. There are some that are that have a nation or area that are tied to them right away. Now, ones I've seen sort of win also have another hook to them that is not just that. So the police procedural AP, I think they knew all along, actually, before that it was police procedural, that it was going to be an Absalom, because they wanted to do an Isle of Kortos and an Absalom AP back-to-back before that. But there definitely is an unannounced one that started with a specific location and a theme, then went back to, oh, maybe we don't like that location, we'll just do the theme, for a while. And then went back to the original specific location and the theme, and then maybe it won't happen. I don't even know if we're going to do that one. But those are just some of the few that I've been in on the brainstorming, which is more of a recent development where some of the brainstorming for APs happens at like general year-long product meetings that I'm in. Normally I wouldn't be there. Let's see. Possible Cabbage says the front matter article for Iron Fang Invasion said the genesis of the AP is let's do an AP where you never have to leave your animal companion behind. Yeah, being in the wilderness, I think, was a big part of that one. So, yeah, there's a whole lot of ways that that adventure paths can be created for their ideas. It's just different. It's a very creative team full of creative ideas, and they don't always, or I guess we don't, because I'm there sometimes too, always do things in the same way each time. There's all sorts of brainstorming. Sometimes there's voting just to see what happened, like with the, interestingly enough, with the ancestries that were in Lost Omens Characters Guide, not only was there a vote, like Eleanor mentioned in the blog, where I came in and said, Leshies, wait, but we wound up retroactively discovering that, so before we had full data from you guys, from the question about what ancestries we would like to see, and we criminally did not mention Leshy on that poll, we just hadn't thought about it at that time. But other than Leshy, which wasn't on the poll, and we correctly determined were very popular, before we had your data, we made a guess, a solid guess, for the top tier ancestries that were going to be the most famous, which we had locked in for Advanced Player's Guide. And then what were going to be the next best ones, and the ones that were more tied into the world of Golarion necessarily, rather than just sort of more generic. And not only that, other than Leshy, which was not on there, those two, the Lizardfolk and the Hobgoblin, were the next two. And the ones that the design team tapped for the Advanced Player's Guide were the top. And I was shocked because, like, that was a lot of choices for us to get them all in the correct order. Certainly, if it was just a probabilistic thing and there was no correlation between our selection and what you guys voted for, and we didn't know what you liked, there's no way we would have picked exactly the ones that were the most popular. There were definitely some things that surprised me that were not as popular, mostly because maybe I know a few people who really like them. Like, certainly, the amount of people who like the Kitsune is a lot less than I thought, based on like being friends with a few people who really, really like them. But there are, we went through those and we figured out some ancestries that we were going to run, and like that had a vote. And there have been votes for things, there have been brainstorms for things, and it turned out that you guys voted for the same things that we did. So I'm glad that means that our voting process was very similar to what the fans actually want, because that's always nice compared to just sort of being, if you're in an ivory tower and you just pick things and they're not what everyone wants, that's not great. Yeah, the new kobolds are really cool looking, and I really like the way that Wayne sort of redesigned the way that they look. I'm excited by them too. They should be very fun. And I know that Peyton is really excited by orcs. He's been wanting to play an orc since like the moment he was here, and so he's gonna be happy about that. And David is curious about how we're going to do the Planar Scions. Well, it should be fun. Should be fun for people who like the Golarian take on Planar Scions. So, we've really actually squirreled a little bit here from early days. So I'm going to put the squirrel in here from early days of Pathfinder Second Edition design over onto like ways that we come up with APs / ancestries. Let's see. Frazzle was asking, what about a second Kingmaker? Linda says, not among the announced APs. I will say that there is an announced second Kingmaker, but it's the second Kingmaker, same as the first Kingmaker. It's the Kingmaker Special, Mega, every edition, every version of the game, and even 5e edition, where it has the full game and then like a little side book you can get for 5th edition or even PF1. So there is a Kingmaker. It just is Kingmaker. Yeah, Elf Trail Dustwalkers are very interesting and exciting. I really like what Linda did with them when she wrote the original, I guess not Ancestry but Race, but it was back in Pathfinder First Edition, and I think they should be interesting moving onwards. I hadn't scrolled up enough to see the thing that was talked about in the chat. Alright then. Well, yeah, Luis said it already. But yes, there is one. It just is the same one. Back to some of the early days of Pathfinder Second Edition. So, we had this vertical slice, and it had spells, it had some monsters, it had the 4 core classes, and we started building up ideas for some of the additional 8 classes. We knew it was going to be the Alchemist pretty much straight away. We had these other polls. One of them was a demographic survey that was sort of, it did not say it was for Pathfinder Second Edition, but we totally used some of the data that you guys gave us, where we discovered that the Alchemist and the Oracle were more popular than like 3 or 4 of the 11, I think 3 of the 11 core rulebook classes in terms of which ones you guys were playing. And, however, the Alchemist was more likely that you guys were actually playing an Alchemist, whereas sometimes the Oracle showed up as just, oh, I took 1 level in Oracle to get Charisma to everything, bye-bye. Or for Lifelink on my Paladin, or something like that. So, because we had 2 metrics, which were, because we had asked you guys what characters you played and you put in the levels. So the metric was, did this class appear? And if so, like, did you actually take your levels in that class, or was it just a dip? Jim says that Sandstone's Secret is best quest ever. And Linwu, you're right. Some people did take the Alchemist dip for mutagen stuff. I'm certainly not saying Alchemist was never in a dip, but Oracle was even more in a dip. So, they were close, but Alchemist was ahead. But there were actually some of the closest classes, like, out, even in the early ones. Like, there were big jumps between some of the most popular classes, which I believe the most popular was, I'm forgetting now because they didn't really matter. We were obviously including them in the game. I think it was Cleric was top, but there were some big jumps, but they were very close. Alchemist was ahead, and Alchemist was way ahead when you considered who was actually playing a full Alchemist. Um, so, Possible Cabbage asked if the three less popular Rulebook classes were perceived as weak or complex. Not really. I don't think so. Like, the Ranger, a lot of people don't think is super weak in Pathfinder First Edition or that complex. Just a lot of people, I think, weren't satisfied with the way that the Rangers' themes were a little bit all over the place and wanted a... Just a lot of people seem to be taking, like, spell-less archetypes for Rangers, and they just wanted a Ranger that had a tighter theme. And they were all taking... like some people taking Trapper, or the other one that has little Rangers tricks to get rid of the spells. And they were taking... archetypes like Guide that got rid of favorite enemy for something that was more reliable. Plus, I think Slayer and some of the other ones were pretty popular too because they didn't have favorite enemy. And just sort of being the fantasy racist who has a little bit of magic that sort of, they had some good spells, but you had to really look into it, and the initial spells in the core rulebook weren't all that good. And they had an animal companion, but until you found the feat that made it drastically more powerful, it wasn't really that powerful yet. And then it was when you used that one feat. Like, I don't know what it is, really. I like Ranger, but it was not very popular. And there were just a few that were less popular than those two. And, of course, the Cavalier was the least popular out of all the classes. I believe it wasn't the one that had the fewest characters, but Jason did a regression that was based on, like, okay, sure, maybe there were a few fewer of this new class that just came out when we did the survey, like, a month ago, but given how long the Cavalier has had to be around, the fact that it's barely ahead of, like, say, Vigilante or whatever the newest one was is not a ringing endorsement. So let's see. People have been talking a lot about this. The Alchemist doesn't seem to be in the best spot right now. Did the removal of resonance cause issues with that? I would say not necessarily. The removal of resonance didn't really affect the Alchemist too much, and the Alchemist in my game has been very effective for the group in a variety of situations, shocking the wizard with what kind of buffs that he can pull out when the team needs it, and generally annihilating things that have elemental weaknesses. Like, my goodness, when the Golem came out, I thought, behind the party, because they had accidentally skipped it while they went accidentally into the boss room, and I combined encounters, I thought the party was going to be in trouble. It was a Golem that was like a level or two higher. The Rogue and the Alchemist went out of the room that they were in fighting the boss encounter to go fight the Golem, and they were fine. The Alchemist annihilated it. He used like a sticky bomb, or whatever it's called, the lingering bomb, to give persistent damage of the type that the Golem was weak against. And it was not good for that Golem. Yeah, Alchemist definitely needs some more options. It's a little tough because just anytime you give them options, you're not giving it to other, like, sort of core characters. Obviously, people can buy the alchemical items if they want. But we want to expand all of the classes, of course. Let's see. Is there a chance the campaign Knights of the Everflame can be made into an AP or something that we can run, says Dark Swordsman? That is not a question that I can really answer. Who knows what the future will bring? I certainly have no idea. Possible Cabbage, you're right. The PF1 Ranger involved knowing the future. If you didn't know what your favorite enemy terrain was, it was very Mother May I. Like, also, if you built if you're in a home game, and even if you sort of knew what you were fighting right then, let's say that you built an overpowered fighter that was ruining the fun for everyone in the game, the GM doesn't really have that many options to stop you other than, like, trying to find your character's weak point. But if you built an overpowered ranger who was ruining the fun for everyone in the game, then the GM would probably just not give you your favorite enemies after that, which is a real bad move on the GM's part. But they might be like, oh, well, you're way ahead, and I can just take away these favorite enemies. Now, the problem is the GM might be perceiving that you're ruining the fun when you're not, and so then you might have a situation where you lost your favorite enemies for not really much reason, and that's something I think people didn't like. Also, certainly in organized play, all of those players probably didn't like Rangers as much because who knows what the heck you're fighting. I mean, you can pick humans, and that's very, very good in organized play, but you still might wind up going to an adventure where there weren't humans, and you don't get your benefits. Eltro says that apparently Jason replied this recently. Cool. Let's see. He said there were no real plans. There need to be more episodes. Sounds good. Jim is right that early access spells like Resist Energy were the best choices for the original core rulebook list of Ranger spells. Even when I said there were some that were good options, I was thinking of Resist Energy. That's pretty good to get at 4th level. Or first for a Hunter. Looks like a few people in chat like the idea of the spell-less Ranger. I mean, we're probably going to put a focus spell option out there at some point. It was very popular to add it later on when we asked about that in the polls. But very few people, surprisingly, even though obviously the people who wanted it to always have spells were very loud, very few people wanted it to be just all spells. You have to have spells, even when we asked. Ular Warlord, I agree that the more options for their formula book are going to help. Also, I think, even though you guys really did not like the Poisoner option for Alchemist, I really think if we bring back a better version of it, we cut it first because we wanted to just make all of the ones that we did put in there have more fates and options, and you guys really didn't like it. But if we put in a better version of the Poisoner that you guys like, I think that it's going to be really good, because the poisons you can make are devastating. Like, once Steven from Roll for Combat gets up our adventure that Linda and I played of Sandstone Secret, we almost died from poison. It's nasty, it's bad, and it's dangerous. But right now, since we don't have a poisoner for the Alchemist can make really good poison for free. You kind of have to give it to the rogue or someone who actually has poisoner abilities. So I think a poisoner Alchemist could be good if we get it right. But we obviously wanted to make sure that the ones you guys liked but thought should have more options, not rather than just doubling down on the one that you didn't like. Let's see. So there are more people who like the PF2 Rangers. The PF2 Rangers didn't have enough stuff in the playtest, but they gained... I mean, if you look at them in the final book, they have so many more feats now. They gained, like, the 4 full pages. They were, I think, the only martial class... Or was it 6? They gained 2 more than everyone else, whatever it was. They were the only martial class that did. I think it was 6, but most classes gained 4 pages, but 2 of them were used on art for, like, the sample characters, so they gained, like, 2 pages of rules, and Rangers gained 6, which was 4 of rules, or something like that. Alright. Most dangerous game, Ranger. Why are the favorite enemy options so constrained in Pathfinder Second Edition? Well, honestly, for a while, we just didn't want to have favorite enemy. And then we thought, well, if we don't have favorite enemy, then someone's going to put in favorite enemy later on, so we might as well just have favorite enemy. And we wanted a favorite enemy that was not something that was like what it was before, where it was like, Mother, may I be more powerful in this encounter? We didn't want to balance the Ranger around, fight your best things and you are way better than any other class, and then otherwise you're worse than any other class. So we just buffed up the Hunter's sort of edges, the special abilities for their hunt prey, and then we put in a favorite enemy that just said, you can just start having hunted a prey if it's from one of these groups. And we picked things that were just very clearly rangery things to hunt. And that's why it's more restricted. Because we can't just say pick any trait for a monster, then you could pick, like, the evil trait, or the medium-sized trait. And we don't want to just put all of the things that used to be types in Pathfinder First Edition, because, well, they're not all types now. And also humanoid, or even human, just show up a lot. They're a weird thing to be hunting. in general, and they're vastly more powerful. So we picked ones that were not that we thought were roughly balanced with each other, so that it would not be like, oh wow, you didn't pick fiend or undead or human. What are you doing? Which is kind of what it was in Pathfinder First Edition. All right. When did class archetypes become a thing in the design process, and when can we finally see one? Well, the idea that there would be class archetypes is one that actually I was even going to talk about this a little bit earlier, but then I forgot because I was more talking about games and which steps we were building. So, remember when we started building those 5-level classes? So very early on in the process, just when we were still sort of running the games, and Steven wanted to mock up what one of those classes would look like. And we wound up with something that, if you can imagine it, think about what the classes currently look like, or what they look like in the playtest. Imagine everything was a class feat. So you want to get that thing where you're an expert in weapons, stuff, and fighter? That's a class feat. Everything is a class feat. Odd and even levels, you get class feats. Everything you just build your own. It was exciting. It was very, very modular. But eventually, Jason pointed out that, first of all, it meant that there was not really any touchstone ability that you would be like, oh yeah, I know I'm going to have this from this class. And so it makes it, when you fight an NPC, it's very hard to feel like you're fighting one from a particular class, because once more and more feats came out, just everything was going to be different every time. And second of all, there were that caused there to be a lot of feats that were just math increases that were the better choice, that some people would not take and be trapped into being bad. And so we wound up turning certain abilities into features at odd levels and feats at even levels. And at that point is also when we came up with... Jason came up with an early idea for archetypes and multi-classing that was actually kind of similar to the final dedication, but wasn't exactly the same. He iterated a few times. He passed it on to me to work on for a little while. And at that point, we talked about what it would be like to have an archetype that was for just an individual class. And when you're going to do that, people might wonder, like, when is it a good idea to make one of these class archetypes? The answer is it usually isn't. Why is it usually not? Well, first of all, everybody can use one if it's not a class archetype. But second of all, you might be thinking, well, what if I wanted an archetype that, I don't even know, gives bow feats to a monk? Well, I guess I screwed the pooch there by saying gives bow feats to a monk. I want to get an archetype that does bows with a monk. When you're adding something, because of the way we did class feats, you could just write bow feats for a monk. You don't need an archetype that's called Zen Archer. You could have Zen Archery. The time when you need a class archetype is not when you're adding something that is specifically for a class. It's actually when you subtract something from a class. There has to be something that you desperately want to not be in there for your vision of what this sort of sub-version of the class looks like. That's the only time you need a class archetype. It's when something needs to be taken away. For instance, if you had a druid that did not have an order, but instead a wizard school of magic, that needs an archetype. It doesn't need an archetype necessarily because it gets a wizard school of magic, although maybe there because it poaches from another class. You might want to be cautious since there's already a wizard multi-class archetype, but it needs an archetype actually because it doesn't have an order. So when you need a class archetype is actually when you're removing something from the class. And so the first time we build something where we want to remove something from the class enough that we're willing to spend 1 to 2 pages of the book that nobody in any other class can possibly use, that's when we're going to wind up probably doing a class archetype, honestly. Possible Cabbage loved the Phantom Thief Rogue since setting up sneak attacks was too fiddly. The Phantom Thief was a fun one for me to write. I wrote it to fill up space in that in that section, because whenever we get archetypes, there's always a certain number that work and a certain number that don't, or have overlap with other ones that we get in, because we have like 20 different authors. So Phantom Thief was just like one that I wrote that was like, oh, we have a little bit of extra space. What kind of weird, intriguing thing can we do? So yeah, basically class archetypes are, I think, just they're gonna, and also we probably wouldn't put them in a really random place. We want to make sure that we carefully looked at the first one so that we were sure they were going to do what we expected them to do. But the class archetypes, that's their sort of niche, which is getting rid of something that you need to get rid of to tell the story that you want to tell with that archetype. And, I mean, it's possible to do it, but remember that anytime we put that out, the other classes don't get something. And we already have some archetypes that are hard to get into, like for certain classes. Like the Hell Knight archetype, just because Armiger requires heavy armor, it's not super easy to become a Hell Knight if you don't start with medium armor, at least not quickly. So there are a lot of reasons why, and already people were saying, well, you know, this is slowing me down if I want to be a wizard. It's not that easy to become a Hell Knight. You still can. Now imagine if we had like the Hell Knight fighter class archetype that only was for fighters, then nobody else but the fighter could take it. So let's see. Could you use class archetypes to give something to a class at a lowest level which you absolutely do not want other classes to get via multi-classing? Yes, but in general, like, let's say you have something like that, such as the Thief Rogue's ability to use their dexterity for damage, and you don't want that just becoming a ubiquitous dip. Like, that could just be, and let's say you got a new one. Let's say you were doing a mastermind rogue that was really smart and planned heists. Then you could make that mastermind, mastermind rogue, basically, option as a new. You wouldn't have to make it as a class archetype, right? You could just make that mastermind be a new type of rogue racket. And if you wanted to do something like someone above was talking about champions that were not worshiping deities, you wouldn't necessarily need a class archetype. You could have new tenets that were like the tenets of mortality. I am a champion of the laws of mortality from Rahadu. And they would actually replace the tenets of good. And Jason says that we don't have to force you to read any of our books to learn how to build archetypes. You can learn about it here. Yeah, so if you want to build a class archetype, it's all about what you're going to remove. And if you don't remove something, then you don't need to build a class archetype. That's just basically what it is. So really, really honestly, I'm more talking about when not to build an archetype than I am when to build an archetype, because I haven't really told you guys about things that we're actually going to do, just kind of things that we're probably not going to do as much. Let's see. Will we see the Cavalier officially at some point? You'll have to find out. Let's see. Force me to read the books. Just try to stop me? No, I think you guys are going to read the books. Let's see. Will we champion of mortality? We've kind of changed it from banned to mortality because it was a little bit gendered before. Alright. So, basically, let's move back a little step from talking about the fact that we haven't had class archetypes, and move back to what we were talking about before, which was just some of the early days and the things we were working on when we were thinking about this game. So where were we back in the time? We were at the point of time where we had all of the characters. We were going to build them out to 20th level. We're gonna build some of the new classes in, and at that point in time, like I said, we figured out what our goals were going to be for Doomsday Dawn. People started coming up with ideas for the adventures in Doomsday Dawn. That kind of got kicked around a few times back and forth before eventually a sort of a plot line emerged based on the story, and with a lot of input from a lot of people past the design team in the world team and the development team, and James and Eric, who had a lot of ideas about which sections we were going to use for the book. of course, as we've mentioned before, we had Wayne just come to the office during a lot of this time, and he was just sketching up a storm with all sorts of concept art and other pictures of things that were going on. So he would just sketch up some possible ideas, like some of the concept art that we put on the blog, of monsters that were really important to us, but that we never had a unified look, that we wanted to have one, and of different weapons and all sorts of other things like that. So that was really cool. When we mentioned before that we had him around, but that was sort of the stage of the process that was in was sort of contemporaneous with. I know it was before Ultimate Wilderness, because he was also able to like show us some sketches involving that iconic while he was around. But it was a very interesting time. And as we were building up and forward, we were also starting to think about the fact that we needed to get this thing ready for the playtest, because we had sort of created packets. We have something that's called the playtest packet 1, I think, that has only the earliest levels of the game, and we have the playtest packet 2. That one is getting a lot closer to being something that vaguely an alpha to the beta of the actual beta playtest that you guys played. And then the next one after the playtest packet 2 is sort of the Pathfinder playtest. And so from there, we had a lot of different input from not only editors helping to edit the text, the developers who had read and played the game, and Liz Liddell, one of the senior editor, had really put it through its paces, read the whole text, and given us a bunch of feedback, and checked out some things at a later point on, once the playtest was actually announced, with like a few new players. And so that's why, if you'll notice, though she usually has editing credit, she has a development credit on the Pathfinder playtest, because of the fact that she did like a full development pass on like the entire text that we've been sending forward. And we really started refining some of the text for you guys. Not just some weird little combined word file that had all the classes and a smattering of other options that people could use, and a sort of another file for some monsters, but we started bulking up those monsters, and we actually did that after we were sure we were done with the playtest book itself, because once we realized that the bestiary was going to be a PDF, suddenly that makes the timing work out a lot easier, because it was not easy. There was a lot of extra hours that we put in, but it does mean that we don't have to get it printed. So we had to get the Pathfinder playtest out to everybody and to be ready to be printed, but we then, once that was done, we could work on the bestiary PDF, the playtestery as we called it, after that. So, Jaded Tempest, I think all of our brains actually did melt a little bit during all of that. My brain is still unmelting a little bit at that point. Really, yeah, as Linda said, you assume much. So really, as we were moving forward at that point, we continued our playtests, iteration after iteration after iteration. Feedback from all sorts of places. I don't want to just call out some feedback, because then I'll miss other feedback. But like, for example, one of the weeks when I said John Compton was playing 6 to 8 characters. One week he played a cleric, and then he gave feedback on all the cleric domains at that point in time. And we just kept taking the feedback. It was all internal at that point, iterating, improving, and getting it ready for the playtest. And I think that this is probably about a good time to stop, because of the fact that once we get into the playtest, that's sort of a different phase, and I think we made it through a pretty good phase here. So, if anyone has any more questions about this early phase that don't sort of get us into a squirrel, I'm going to, otherwise I'm going to say goodbye to YouTube. So, bye YouTube, see you next time.